Good morning, it's Roger Gilbert here from the Rongo Live video studio, bringing a new story on our grain industry from Australia. I'm very proud to have Dr. Jared Greenville in the studio this morning, my time. He's the Executive Director of ABARES, which is the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics and Science. We'll ask him a little bit about that. But Jared, Dr. Greenville, welcome.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for having me along. Happy to be here.
Yes, well, you're obviously on a different time zone to me. It's getting late in your working day, and it's just the start of mine. However, I understand from my colleague who represents that part of the world that Australia is expecting a big harvest this year, or this harvest. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. So this coming year, or this financial year, as we report the 2020-21 season, the 21-22 season, we're looking to have a really big year. In fact, across agriculture, across all the suite of products that we grow, it's looking to be our biggest year ever on record. And that follows up what was our biggest year on record previously last year. So we've had two really good seasons across the country. And for this year, it's really been driven by a comeback in our grains industry. What we're seeing and what we haven't seen in the past very often is good conditions on the west coast of Australia and the east coast. And because Australia is such a large continent, that we can often get variable conditions. We'll get really poor conditions in the east, but okay conditions in the west, or vice versa. But seem to have come together at this point in time, and we're seeing those good conditions across the country. And that's also occurring at the same time as you'll be aware that international prices for a number of grains and also for meat products, it's really quite high. So those two factors are combining to deliver a pretty good year for Australian farmers.
Yeah, and when you mentioned climatic conditions, I mean, is this an unusual situation where both climates seem to be the same through the growing season?
Yeah, it's really quite unusual. And to be honest, when we started this year back in March, when we do our forecast for the coming season, we weren't at all predicting that this would happen, this would play out. We had a good year last year, which rarely gets followed up by another good year. Around June, the weather systems really started to shift, and we started to move towards a La Nina type event on the eastern seaboard, which would then come into fruition now over summer. But also for the west, and we had a negative Indian Ocean dipole, which also delivered some rain across the whole southern part of the continent. So to have these two events come in, and on the back of a La Nina last year, which really delivered pretty good conditions on the east coast, is not something that we see. And it's about a 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 year event that we get these weather systems across the continent, or across particularly the wheat sheep zones, we call it here, where we grow most of our grain. And so this is a pretty good outcome, or pretty rare outcome, really.
Yeah. So it's not only in tonnage terms, but it's in value as well.
Yeah, that's right. So when we look at the crops overall, our winter crop, which is our kind of dominant cropping system given where we are in the hemisphere, we're looking to produce around 58.4 million tonnes of crop, and that's going to be our biggest ever wheat crop, our biggest ever canola crop, our second ever biggest barley crop. And so they're our main winter crops. We're looking at some pretty good numbers for our summer crops, and a return of cotton production, a return of rice, because our water storages are quite high. And that's been coupled with good prices for wheat, but some record prices that we're seeing for canola. And so those factors are really driving what we're seeing in terms of the value then side. So high tonnage and high value.
And with the harvest in mind, are all these crops harvested at once? And if so, how do you see the harvest going with these record crops in terms of transportation, harvesting, transportation and storage? I mean, are there issues around those factors?
It is a watch point certainly. So we already had, a big crop last year, which is contributing to, I guess, some scarcity in storage in particular. Despite the pandemic going on, Australia's really continued a pretty rapid pace of export. So we're still getting products out of the market. We're also coming off the back of, previous to these 2 seasons, really 3 poor seasons, and particularly on the eastern states, we had 3 years of production declines and sometimes no production at all in terms of our grain. So we really ran down our stocks to really low levels, and at the time, 2 years ago, there was concerns that Australia was going to really run out of some of its stocks of wheat, particularly milling wheat, feed wheat also, and so forth. So we started with a position where we had capacity. So far, we've managed to still export, but there is a lot of pressure on the internal logistics and supply chains to get this crop off and out. One of the things that we've noticed, because it's been quite cool as well, and we've got some flooding, particularly in New South Wales, is that the harvest is delayed. And so that's also, I guess, helping with some of the logistics of what we're seeing in terms of getting that off. And so we're a bit behind effectively of where we would otherwise be in terms of harvest at this time of year, just because it's been fairly cool and wet.
So when are you expecting the harvest to be complete?
Well, it should be starting to wrap up. So the weather across most of eastern Australia we got summer, over just the last few weeks, and we're getting some higher temperatures back, which will help dry out some of the paddocks enough to get headers and so forth in. We would have otherwise expected most of New South Wales to be done by now, but they were starting to really ramp up now, and that will go into Victoria. Queensland's been harvested, and WA as well. So we expect really in the next little while, next few weeks, that much of the harvest will be complete.
And unlike possibly the UK, as it were, and other countries that are experiencing difficulties with hauliers through the pandemic, what you're suggesting, what you're saying is the pandemic is having very little impact on the actual harvest and delivery of grain into storage.
Yeah, so far so good. I don't necessarily want to jinx that, because right at the moment there's been a bit of press and a bit of concern over a fuel additive for diesel vehicles, and so that's the AdBlue additive. That's a pollution reduction, and many of the modern diesel engines actually require it to run. So there's a bit of concern over the haulage sector there about whether they'll have enough. Government and the industry is trying to secure supplies. It's urea which is the issue, which is a global issue at the moment. So that's the main additive that goes into that. So far so good, and we're hoping that is more of a watch at the moment, and the solution comes in time, and so that will hopefully mean that the grain will get into storage. The other issue in storage, because there's I guess much more informal storage or less secure storage at the moment, just given the size of the crop, is that there's a risk that we had a mouse plague at the end of last year.
Yes,
cooler and wetter weather knocked those numbers way down, and also, as well as pretty good pest control. But some of the less secure, particularly on-farm storages and the like, are at risk of that becoming an issue again as we go into summer.
Yeah. And finally, I've got a question here about markets. How do you see markets demand developing? You might like to explain to us just a little bit about ABARES, because I know you're on the science side, etc., of things. But maybe you have a comment around markets.
Yeah. So the bureau that I run here is really the research arm of the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. So we're part of the department, and we've been doing work in both the economic side and sciences for the past 75 years. And so part of our role is to keep an eye on markets. Australia exports around 70% of what it produces, so international markets are really our main market when it comes to understanding what's driving value for Australian agriculture. Where we're seeing markets go, in some senses, a bit uncharted territory for our meat products. So we've had continued increase in value in meat products, and initially kicked off by African swine fever in China. That's continuing on. for grain markets, what we're really seeing is both some disruption in terms of supplies, and some of the main markets have, say, made some big suppliers out of Europe, Ukraine and Russia, but also those dry conditions which are affecting North America and particularly Canada for canola. So there's a bit of, I guess, uncertainty about the supply of milling wheat in particular, and also canola, and we're seeing prices go quite high. We're expecting that really to continue for the next little while, into next year. Of course, understanding what's going to happen with the weather in Australia is hard enough, yet let alone what's happening in the global scale. But as production comes back in the next growing season, or at least maybe potentially returning to more average levels, some of those price pressures are likely to moderate. We wouldn't expect prices to stay this high for too long. And then there's always that policy question as to what governments are doing around that as well. And as we saw in a few times in history, that when prices get high, governments can sometimes get a bit concerned and will undertake policy actions that are ultimately generally counterproductive, but that can cause prices to move rapidly and in uncertain ways.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. You did mention, which I'd like to just ask about, you mentioned an environmental aspect to the work that the Bureau does. Is COP26 on your radar in terms of the industry's overall global footprint in carbon? I mean, is that an area that the Bureau pays attention to?
Yes, it is, and it's certainly on our industry's radar as well. So, as with many, I guess, agricultural nations, livestock emissions account for the bulk of our emission profile from agriculture. Our livestock industry has a target to be carbon neutral by 2030, and they've already undertaken a series of research and a number of investments that they're putting in to try and achieve that task. We've done some work also looking at, I guess, Australia's relative emissions profile, and shows that we really have, in some areas, a comparative advantage, that we sit kind of middle of the pack in terms of our emissions profile. We're a little bit higher than some of the major importing countries, but we're certainly a fair bit lower than some of the other major exporting countries. So with the industry's view of trying to use their push towards a carbon neutral product or a low carbon product, I think that there's certainly scope for Australian agriculture to be I guess there's a number of opportunities regarding where they would go in a low carbon future.
Yeah, no, very interesting. We should keep an eye on that, and if you have any developments, you're welcome to join us again. But Dr. Greenville, thank you very much for joining us from Australia this morning.
No problem. Thanks very much for having me on, and all the best as well.
Yeah, thank you. Bye for now.